Howdy fellow tubers! Over the last several years, there's been a growing divide between two schools of thought. Specifically, linear and open world game design, which exploded into a much bigger divide when, among other things, Nintendo pivoted from the formula established by The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time to fully open world games with Breath of the Wild. This has led to a reoccurring complaint that the non-linear design undermines the tightly focused adventures the series is known for. In the process, overselling just how much the games based off of the Ocarina of Time formula truly benefit from linear design. Contrary to what you might think based on the title, I'm not here to tell you linear design is bad. There's certainly logic to the idea that a linear series of events from beginning to middle to end allows a literary narrative to be easier to digest, and usually more effectively conveyed. Likewise, the mechanical narrative gains a great deal of effectiveness through cohesive linear design, including reinforcing the literary narrative, teaching the player the mechanics of the game through gameplay, and focusing the player's direction to avoid choice paralysis. There's a lot of value to be had in linear game design, and the more open a game's design is, the more of those advantages are lost. The problem is that Zelda, and many other games with tight linear design, don't actually use the linear design for those purposes. In many titles, there's so little on-screen character development, and events are so disconnected from each other, that the mechanical narrative has nothing definitive to reinforce. And in the case of adventures like Zelda, if dungeons and boss fights are all built around using only the episodic specific tool with no allowance for or incorporation of previous items, there is no building of complexity or mastery of mechanics. Execution matters as much as intention or potential, and the fact that this aspect of the conversation has been ignored for so long kinda grinds my gears. But it also feels like a good place to start some game design analysis. So, for my first essay series on this channel, I'm revisiting games that have strict linear structure, pointing out why I think they're flawed, contemplating the lessons learned by the example, and give an example of how they could have been improved upon. This is Ocarina of Time and the Linearity Problem. To get us all on the same page, I'll start by summarizing the plot. Ocarina of Time's story, almost in its entirety, reads thusly. Link and Zelda both have the same nightmare about Ganondorf. Link awakens to be called by the Great Deku Tree, who clarifies that said dream was a vision of the growing darkness in the land and gives Link a quest to stop said darkness. In the process of exploring beyond his forest home for the first time, Link finds his way into the Palace Gardens, where Zelda gives a face to the coming darkness and proposes a means of thwarting his schemes. It is also at this time Impa equips him with a song that is a crucial tool throughout the story. Link then sets out to acquire the gems necessary to enter the Temple of Time and protect them from Ganondorf. After achieving this early goal, Link returns to the capital city to regroup with Zelda, only to be confronted by Ganondorf, who Link is not currently equipped to fight. Meanwhile, Zelda, who is fleeing the capital, passes on the Ocarina of Time, the last piece necessary to enter the Temple of Time and gain access to the Master Sword and the Triforce. She then entrusts Link to open the Gate of Time with the intention of protecting the Triforce, not knowing Link will be sealed away by the Master Sword until he reaches adulthood, and thus leaves the door to the Triforce open. When Link wakes up, he is told of how the plan backfired, and given a mission to join forces with the Sages of the Elements in order to confront Ganondorf, who has taken over the kingdom during Link and Zelda's absence. Before he can make it very far, he is informed by Sheik that he is missing a crucial tool for completing a majority of the quest, and he goes on a side quest to acquire it. With that resolved, Link arrives in the houses of each sage to find the people oppressed by Ganondorf and has to resolve the problem in order to free up the local sage for the assistance. At each location, Zelda, disguised as Sheik, provides assistance while musing about what has been lost due to their failures as children. When all the sages are restored, Sheik reveals herself to be Zelda, and gives Link the weapon necessary to defeat Ganondorf. Ganondorf takes the opportunity to capture her, escalating the stakes of the upcoming fight. Finally, Link fights his way through Ganondorf's tower, and defeats him, the sages sealing him away in the darkness. Now that we've established a rough outline of the story, let's run through the ways the linear game design fails to reinforce both the literary and mechanical narrative. First, the literary narrative. After Link has acquired Zelda's lullaby, it really doesn't matter which location he goes to in what order. At least, not based on the content that is in the game itself. The fact that Zelda sends Link to the Gorons first amounts to very little, considering the people in Kakariko don't stop treating Link like a random child even though his heroism has earned him status as a brother to the Gorons. The Kokiri, the Zora, and the Gerudo certainly don't care what anybody else is doing, and after their initial meeting, Zelda doesn't contact Link again until she passes on the Ocarina of Time. Even if you want to argue the very specific atmospheric detail of crossing Hyrule Field as it goes from calm sky to ominous storm clouds, when Link returns to Castletown after retrieving Zora's Sapphire, those clouds don't actually appear until Link is right in front of the castle. So there's plenty of time to walk away from Kakariko Village and still experience the building gloom if gaining the Goron's Ruby were to come after the Zora's Sapphire. Next up is the bottom of the well, which, outside of the silly and not narratively important detail of the paradoxical time loop caused by Link learning the Song of Storms as an adult because he apparently played it as a child, is something that could happen anytime after Link leaves the forest. Dead Hand has no direct connection to Bongo Bongo, and Sheik makes no mention of needing the Eye of Truth to face the Shadow Temple. It's simply a useful tool that happens to be in close proximity because of how closely tied to the Sheikah both forces are. Then there's the adult era, which has the odd literary mechanical narrative intersection of the hookshot, which is, mechanically speaking, significantly more crucial to completing any of the dungeons than any item received in said dungeons themselves, yet narratively is the random invention of some no-name gravedigger who hands it over to Link after a single foot race. Once the hookshot is acquired, there is no narrative reason for any of the temples to be visited in a specific order. Returning to the forest and the subsequent revelations about Link's heritage don't matter to Ganondorf, Zelda, Navi, or even Mr. Silent Protagonist himself. And it certainly never comes up again. Furthermore, Phantom Ganon is so complex symbolically, it's the kind of encounter that could just as reasonably serve as the penultimate challenge before the real fight with Ganondorf, as it does being an illustration of how much stronger Link is an adult body with the Master Sword. Then there's the development for all the races. The Gorons are the only ones to acknowledge Link's heroism as a child, but even they only acknowledge Hyrule's state of decline in so much as it affects them. And outside of Darunia being the Sage of Fire, they offer no noticeable assistance to any of the other races once you've freed them. As for the only surviving Zoras, the King and Ruto are entirely focused on thawing Zora's domain, a task they infamously fail to complete, and while Lake Hylia's drainage should be an issue of significant importance to everyone in Hyrule, the restoration of which being a moment worthy of celebration, none of the other races mention it. The one moment that anything significant happens in the overworld beyond the technically timeless plight each individual region suffers is the Bongo Bongo incident in Kakariko, where Sheik is attacked. It's specifically scripted to happen after the player completes the forest, fire, and water temples, but not only does this come out of nowhere, with neither Ganondorf or Zelda, ever hinting that the conflict between the two sides might escalate during or after any of the 3 required dungeons, it doesn't even have enough permanent consequences to prevent Sheik from appearing at the Spirit Temple 1 dungeon later, and does nothing to change the status quo of Kakariko Village in the adult era. Finally, the Gerudo are so mysterious and uninvolved in the plot, you could stumble upon them at any time throughout the course of the plot and it wouldn't change anything. Meanwhile, the mechanical narrative has much more defined gates in its progression that are harder to dismiss, but they're such soft and inconsequential gates from a storytelling perspective, it's hard to say they support the literary narrative. The Deku Tree is purely a tutorial, hosting a number of puzzles, traversal scenarios, and combat encounters that most dungeons have some variation of, but the primary gimmick of the dungeon is shield bouncing nuts back at the enemy, a mechanic that virtually never comes back. The slingshot does introduce the eye shooting mechanic, which does recur throughout a majority of the game, but as a weapon, it's mostly limited to working on flying enemies and spiders that you have literally no other means of killing. Dodongo's Cavern is a series of set pieces involving bombs, but they're surprisingly inconsistent in how necessary they are for the rest of the dungeons. Particularly Jabu Jabu's Belly, the dungeon that happens immediately after. Well, a majority of Jabu Jabu's Belly is made up of set pieces and puzzles that exist in other portions of the game. Because Link can't use the boomerang for a majority of the rest of the game anyway, it's only required for 1 puzzle in the Spirit Temple. The well doesn't require any item from any other dungeon, and Dead Hand actively resists everything other than a good whack with the sword. Moving along to Adult Link. While this portion of the game is relatively open-ended when compared to Child Link, you can't really accomplish anything without the hook shot. Which, on the one hand, it's super weird that for all the importance placed on the Master Sword, the hook shot supersedes it as the key to Link's success. But on the other hand, acquiring it mirrors the process of acquiring the Kokiri sword at the beginning of the Child era, with the player being required to go get themselves acquainted with the world of the game, and equipping themselves with an essential tool before they can progress through the story. After the hookshot's acquisition, the mechanical narrative does allow the player to visit the Forest and Fire Temple in any order, but arbitrarily prevents the player from finishing the Water Temple, where the bow is only used once and the hammer isn't used at all. Not to mention the fact that neither is remotely helpful against Morpha. Then there's the Shadow Temple, which is absolutely bizarre. The most necessary items to get for the Shadow Temple are Din's Fire, an item you are never required by narrative to encounter, a single anchor point, which is far enough to require the long shot, and the Hover Boots, an item you get almost immediately upon entering the temple. Though in fairness, Bongo Bongo's fight significantly involves the bow, so there is some justification for requiring the Forest Temple first. The Spirit Temple is debatably the best execution of the sense of progression the linear design philosophy is supposed to achieve. Even if it were possible to get to the desert as a child, there's a gulf at the entrance that requires the hover boots or the long shot to cross. You can cross the desert without the Lens of Truth, if you're obstinate enough, but the Spirit Temple itself requires both the boomerang and bombs to complete. Then the adult section comes along with a dungeon item that's entirely useless outside this dungeon, light reflection puzzles that have no direct connection to any puzzles or items in the game, and a tedious boss fight so entrenched in how amazing the mirror shield is, it completely disables all the other tools you worked so hard to accumulate throughout the game. On that note, there's several more weird through lines that I wasn't sure where else to bring up, but they're worth mentioning because they have positives and negatives as far as the linear narrative is concerned. On the one hand, the spawn point goes from a town with friendly NPCs, a shop, and some of the better on-foot travel shortcuts in the game, to an isolated corner, one has to carefully circumvent tedious and potentially dangerous enemies in order to escape, representing the escalation of stakes over the course of the story. On the other hand, nighttime Hyrule Field as a child is already overrun with monstrosities, while as an adult, Hyrule Field is almost a safe haven, day or night. Next, there's Epona, who on paper is meant to be this incredible traversal upgrade. But not only is she heavily limited in where she can go as an adult, but because the game has you bouncing back and forth between child and adult era in the later portion of the game, she's merely a contextual upgrade that's really only useful for side quests that don't matter in the grand scheme of the linear narrative. Perhaps the most bizarre example of a through line is the already mentioned Din's Fire, because again, the game does technically point the player in the direction of that mini-quest through the narrative, but it's an optional side quest that comes after another optional side quest, and it is not mechanically required at any other point in the game, making its sudden inclusion arbitrary. So then, having explored the cracks in Ocarina of Time's narrative and mechanical structure, let's examine what we've learned about the linearity problem. Number 1. Be consistent with your progression. Linear design means a straight path forward, so if you're gonna flip-flop between states of upgraded and not so upgraded, what even is the point? Number 2. Continuity is important. If you treat each level of your game like an almost timeless incident, you can't assume the player's going to read anything more into it just because you force them to visit those levels in a specific order. And number 3, distinguish between what is optional and what is not. If something is mechanically required, that is not simply a side quest you can merely hint at. And if something is mechanically the crux of your gameplay, it deserves an emotional narrative connection to your protagonist more than a random NPC. To put all this into practice, I've imagined a hypothetical alternate version of Ocarina of Time I feel would have made a much better use of the linear design to tell a more compelling story, both mechanically and narratively, while adding as little content as possible to avoid the problem of essentially asking for a completely different game. The opening remains as canon, up until Link enters Hyrule Field, where there are no stall kids as a child. When Link visits Zelda, she tells Link about needing the gems and where to get them. But instead of giving Link a letter of recommendation, she advises him to equip himself with a Hylian shield and provides him with some extra funds. Following that, the reason Link travels to the Gorons first is not because he was mandated to go there by Zelda, but because both paths are blocked. Death Mountain by the Gate Guard, and Zora's Domain by the rocks. So Link visits Saria, who knows a path into the Goron city through the Lost Woods. Upon revisiting her, she teaches him her song, which is shown to make a number of creatures dance with energy, hinting at its potential use for Darunia. After Link saves the Gorons and becomes their hero, they inform Link that they can't do much to help the Zora because of their immobility in water, but they can open the passage blocked off by Ganondorf to let Link and the other Hylians enter to aid them. This happens off-screen while Link is visiting the Great Fairy on the mountain, who gives Link Din's Fire, swapping the spin attack to Hyrule Castle. When Link passes through the path to Zora's Domain, he meets a soldier or two explaining that they cleared out the path of monsters, so there's no Octoroks in the path, which makes it all the more prominent that they've overtaken the river when you come through as an adult. After having acquired the Zora's Sapphire, Link returns to Zelda, only to encounter Ganondorf as Zelda flees, which causes all the events leading to the time skip. In the adult era, after Rauru has explained our new objective, Sheik brings Link to a Sheikah training ground in Kakariko, where she gives him the hookshot after challenging him to a race that's meant to demonstrate the trainee's mastery of exploration without the hookshot. After she gives Link the hookshot, Dampé reveals himself and offers a rematch the way he does in the original game. After getting the player equipped, Sheik directs you to return to the forest from whence you came to see the full extent of Ganondorf's corruption, and gather your courage for the task at hand. In this version, the Stall Kids appear at night as an adult, but the Poes are still there as well. Upon returning to the forest only to find it overrun, events play out the same as in canon, and then, having learned his true origins, in absence of a living biological family, Link is directed to meet with and aid the found family he's built so far, including his fiancée and honorary brother. However, because even the waterfall at the entrance of Zora's domain is frozen over, he needs the power of the Fire Sage to cancel the ice at the entrance to Zora's domain. Multiple times throughout the adult era, Link will have to rematch a weaker version of Phantom Ganon, including the entrance to Goron City, inside the Ice Cavern replacing the Wolfos, during the siege on Kakariko, and the large room in the Spirit Temple with the statue that links the child and adult sections. Furthermore, after the Water Temple, Sheik reveals while Link has been gathering the Sage's powers, Ganondorf has not been idle, and has found Impa's hiding place in Kakariko, which is why he unleashes Bongo Bongo to attack. But after Link appears, and uses Raru's light to contain him in the Shadow Temple, Sheik uses her wisdom to point Link in the direction of the Lens of Truth. In this version of events, Link learns the Song of Storms from Azora, grateful for the times Link has helped them, and hoping he will further restore the waters of Hyrule, as well as aid other races the Zora cannot reach. After having completed the Shadow Temple, Impa reveals that the last sage is found in Ganondorf's homeland, the desert. In this version of the Twinrova fight, both Kome and Kotake, as well as Twinrova, are vulnerable to both elemental arrow types, which don't do nearly as much damage as deflecting their magic back at them, but allow you to actively whittle their health down while you're waiting for them to cast the correct elemental spell. Events play out the same from there. So there's my take on Ocarina of Time in relation to the linear versus open world debate. Again, I don't think linear design is bad, but I do think Zelda generally fails to use linear structure to tell its stories more effectively or provide a better sense of progression. The things that have made Zelda compelling and iconic over the years come from many other factors besides linear game design. In the event that we have to agree to disagree, I hope you at least found my hypothetical scenarios entertaining, or learned a new perspective on the franchise that helps you emphasize better with fans of the open world formula. And the next time you argue the superiority of linear game design, make sure you've accounted for the linearity problem.